The Galactic Council didn't notice the human smiling. The seat was too tall for the desk, and the desk was too far from the center, and nobody had bothered to fix either problem before I walked in. That was the first thing I noticed when I entered the grand convocation hall of the Galactic Council. Not the architecture, which was genuinely staggering. Not the 47 alien species arranged in a sweeping crescent of elevated platforms, each one representing a civilization that had been sailing between stars while my ancestors were still figuring out fire. Not even the soft, layered hum of 40 different translation systems running simultaneously, each one turning alien sound into something resembling language. No, the first thing I noticed was that my chair was wrong. My name is Dara Voss. I am 31 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized city in northern England, studied political science at a university that nobody outside the country has heard of, and spent 6 years working in interplanetary resource law before the government called me and said, with absolutely no ceremony, that I had been selected as Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Council. They said it like they were offering me a position on a committee. I later found out that I was not the first choice. I was not the second, third, or fourth choice either. The original selection had declined. The backup had suffered a medical issue. The third candidate had, quite reasonably, experienced what the official record described as a stress response and what the unofficial record described as refusing to leave his flat for 2 weeks. By the time they reached me, the council's deadline for Earth to submit credentials was 4 days away. I said yes before they finished the sentence. That was 6 weeks before I walked into the convocation hall and discovered that my chair was too tall for the desk. The hall itself was enormous, carved from a dark mineral that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with great curving walls that rose to a ceiling so high it had its own weather system. I am not exaggerating. There was, on the morning I arrived, a thin layer of cloud near the upper arches. The council had been meeting in this hall for roughly 4,000 years. The architecture had been built for species that were taller, wider, and in several cases structurally different from a human being. The Veth, who had the largest platform, were somewhere between 3 and 4 meters tall, with 4 arms and a posture that suggested they had evolved on a world with higher gravity. The Oranis, seated directly across the hall, were barely visible from where I stood. They resembled large, pale insects and communicated by modulating their wing vibrations, which the translation system converted into a sort of dry, clipped whisper in my ear. There were representatives from 47 other species. I had memorized all of them before I left Earth. Not just their names and their worlds, but their histories, their political structures, their trade relationships, their recent votes, their ancient disputes, and the specific clauses of the Council Charter that governed their membership. I had also memorized the entire Council Charter itself, all 10,000 pages of it, including the appendices, the procedural amendments, and the historical footnotes. I had done this over the course of one night. This is not a boast. I had simply decided that if I was going to walk into a room where everyone had a 1,000-year head start on me, I was going to walk in having done my homework. Nobody knew that yet. Nobody was particularly paying attention to me at all. The Veth ambassador, a being named Councillor Vreth, was the one who had engineered Earth's admission to the Council. He had needed a 48th vote to break a procedural deadlock on a resource resolution, and Earth had been the fastest candidate world to contact given the time constraint. Our admission had been voted through in under 6 hours, with minimal debate, and the general consensus among the other species seemed to be that it was a temporary measure that would sort itself out eventually. Vreth himself barely glanced at me when I took my seat. He was deep in conversation with the Solan ambassador, a species of tall, silver-skinned beings who communicated in harmonic tones and seemed permanently amused by everything. The Solan translation always came out sounding faintly sarcastic. I had noted this. My seat was in the outermost ring of the chamber at the very end of the crescent, the furthest from the central podium. The translation earpiece I had been issued was a generation behind the current model, the kind that occasionally dropped syllables and had a slight delay. I had been given it without apology as though it were standard. I put it in without comment. The session opened. A VETH administrator announced the agenda in a language my earpiece translated with a slight buzzing undertone. There were 12 items on the agenda. I had read about 11 of them in the pre-session briefings. The 12th was a late addition, added that morning, related to a minor territorial adjustment in a sector I knew well from my resource law background. I did not speak. I sat and listened and watched. And at some point, somewhere in the second hour of proceedings, a small, strange feeling settled over me. Not anxiety, not awe, not the dizzying sensation of being wildly out of my depth, though all of those were present too. It was something else, something quieter. It took me a moment to identify it. It was possibility. Because here is what I saw when I looked around that room. I saw ancient powers moving on ancient rails. I saw alliances held together by tradition rather than trust. I saw the Veth and the Solon talking past each other with the comfortable fluency of two species that had been rivals for so long they had stopped actually listening. I saw the smaller member worlds sitting in their own outer rings, quiet and overlooked, casting votes that were always outnumbered and never consulted before decisions were made. I saw a system that had been running on the same assumptions for 4,000 years. And then I saw my own seat, too tall, too far back, issued a second-rate earpiece, given a rule book as a formality. Nobody expected anything from me. I looked down at the data pad in front of me, where I had saved the 10,000 pages of the council charter, and I felt something settle in my chest like a key turning in a lock. I smiled. Across the hall, the Veth ambassador was making a procedural motion. The hall hummed with the sound of 47 civilizations doing what they had always done, in the way they had always done it. Nobody noticed the human smiling, which was, as it turned out, exactly how I needed it. 3 months. That is how long I went without saying anything significant on the council floor. This drove my government contact, a man named Oliver Burke, absolutely out of his mind. Oliver was a senior official in the Earth Diplomatic Service, and he called me every 72 hours from a relay station just inside the heliopause to check on my progress. His idea of progress was speeches, statements, formal objections, visible, recordable evidence that Earth had a presence in the room. "You need to be seen," he told me, on what I counted as the 9th call. "I am seen," I said. "I'm at every session. I've never missed a vote." Voting with the majority every time isn't a strategy, Dara. It is for now. He did not like that answer. But Oliver was 4 light towers away, and I was the one in the room, so I continued doing exactly what I had been doing. What I had been doing was watching. Not passively. There is a difference between sitting quietly and actually watching, the same way there is a difference between hearing and listening. I was tracking everything. Every exchange on the floor, every side conversation I could catch fragments of, every pattern in the way different species voted and why, and more importantly, every relationship in that hall that looked solid on the surface but had something softer underneath. The Veth and the Solon had a trade compact that was publicly friendly and privately tense. The Solon had twice in the past decade quietly adjusted shipping routes in ways that benefited their own extraction operations at the expense of Veth-aligned territories. The Veth knew. The Solon knew the Veth knew. Both continued behaving as though the compact was fine, because neither could afford the diplomatic cost of addressing it openly. That tension was real, and it was load-bearing, and nobody was talking about it. The Oran Confederacy, a group of 7 small species who had banded together into a single council seat roughly 800 years ago, was showing fractures. 2 of the 7 member species had been in a low-level territorial dispute for 60 years. And the strain was visible in how their joint representative voted. Not dramatically, just a slight hesitation before certain motions, a pattern of abstentions that did not quite line up with stated Oran policy. The Oranis, the insect-like species who had been members for 11,000 years and held a permanent advisory position on the Council's highest procedural body, were genuinely respected by almost everyone and actively trusted by almost nobody. They had a habit of facilitating agreements that left both parties feeling vaguely that they had gotten slightly less than they should have. Nobody could ever prove this. It was simply the Oranis' way. I wrote all of it down, not on any network system, in a paper notebook, the kind you could buy at any shop in any city on Earth, with a pen, in a handwriting that nobody else could read without effort. The second thing I was doing was making friends. Not with the ambassadors, with everyone else. The station that housed the Galactic Council was called Nexus Station, and it was enormous, a sprawling structure that had been expanded and modified over so many centuries that its original design was archaeologically buried beneath layers of renovation. It housed not just the council chambers but the entire support infrastructure for 48 diplomatic missions, including thousands of staff, translators, technicians, and service workers. Most of the ambassadors never spoke to any of them. I spoke to all of them. There was a woman named Priya who worked in the document archive and had been there for 9 years and knew exactly which historical records were real and which had been quietly amended. There was a man named Cal who managed the translation system maintenance and could tell you which ambassador's earpiece was set to a faster feed than the standard issue and who had requested that upgrade. There was a being named Set, who was not human but had worked in the station's administrative core for 40 years and communicated in a pattern of light pulses that, through the translation system, came out sounding like a patient, elderly professor. Set knew everyone. Set remembered everything. None of these people were invited to diplomatic receptions. None of them had ever been asked their opinion on council proceedings by anyone other than me. They were, as a result, extraordinarily forthcoming. I learned things from them that I could not have learned from any official briefing. I learned which upcoming votes had already been privately decided before the session opened. I learned which ambassador had recently made a personal financial arrangement with a soul-in-trade house that created a subtle but real conflict of interest. I learned that the Veth had been quietly lobbying 3 smaller member worlds in advance of a major vote on resource extraction rights that was still 2 months away. I filed all of it in my notebook. And then, on a quiet afternoon in the 3rd month, sitting in the archive with Priya while she cataloged a set of historical procedural documents, I found it. It was not dramatic. That is the thing nobody tells you about the moments that change everything. They rarely announce themselves. Priya was showing me a set of original council founding documents that had been digitized but never fully indexed, the kind of administrative task that nobody had prioritized, because the founding documents were considered purely historical. I was reading through them out of thoroughness, the same way I read everything, and in the 3rd appendix of a supplementary amendment passed 4,012 years ago, I found a clause. The clause of foundational equity. It was written in early council legal language, which my translation system rendered in a slightly archaic but perfectly readable form. The substance of it was this: any world admitted to the council on a probationary basis, having completed 3 full council cycles without a single procedural violation on record, would be entitled to claim full voting rights retroactive to the date of their original admission. 3 full council cycles. Each cycle was roughly 1 Earth year. Earth had been admitted 11 months ago. I had not committed a single procedural violation. I had voted at every session, filed all required documentation on time, and followed every rule in the 10,000-page charter precisely, partly because I had read all 10,000 pages and knew exactly what the rules were. 1 more month. 1 more month of clean record, and I could invoke a clause that would give Earth 3 years of retroactive voting rights on decisions already made. I read the clause twice, then I read it a third time. I looked at Priya. She was labeling a file and had not noticed what I was reading. I wrote the clause number in my notebook, closed the document, and thanked her for her time. I walked back to my quarters through the long corridors of Nexus Station, and I thought about what I had just found. 3 years of backdated votes meant the ability to formally reopen several trade agreements that had been ratified before Earth joined the Council. Agreements that had quietly carved the star systems closest to Earth's expansion corridor out of any human access, treating them as pre-allocated extraction zones for the 5 largest Council powers. Nobody had told Earth about those agreements at the time. There had been no reason to. Earth was not a Council member. Earth was not in the room. Now I was in the room. I thought about the rulebook they had handed me on my first day, that casual gesture of a 10,000-page document pressed into my hands like a formality. I thought about the second-rate earpiece and the too-tall chair and 30 months of nobody paying attention to the human in the outermost ring. I thought about Oliver Burke, calling every 72 hours, asking when I was going to start being visible. Soon, I thought, very soon. Back in my quarters, I sat down at my desk and began writing. Not in the notebook this time, in the formal legal language of Council procedure, precise and careful and airtight. I drafted the invocation 3 times that night, each version slightly cleaner than the last. When I was satisfied, I saved it, closed the document, and went to sleep. The next morning, I attended the session as I always did, sat in my too-far seat, wore my second-rate earpiece, and said nothing on the floor. But I was smiling. And this time, it was because I knew exactly what was coming. The session that changed everything was not supposed to be remarkable. The Outer Arm Resource Compact had been in development for 8 months. It was a sweeping agreement between the 5 largest Council powers to formally designate a broad region of star systems in the galactic Outer Arm as open resource territories. Open was a diplomatic term. What it meant in practice was that the 5 powers, the Veth, the Solon, the Durac Assembly, the Collective of Myra, and the Yessan Sovereignty, would have exclusive rights to resource extraction across the region for the next 200 years. Several of those star systems were adjacent to Earth's projected expansion corridor, not inside it, adjacent to it, which meant that as humanity grew outward, as we eventually would, we would find ourselves surrounded on multiple sides by resource operations controlled entirely by other powers, with no legal standing to object, negotiate access, or establish our own presence. This had been arranged, quietly, before Earth was admitted to the Council. I had known about it for 2 months. I had said nothing and done nothing visible. I had spent those 2 months preparing. The session opened at the standard time. I sat in my seat at the outer edge of the chamber. 47 other ambassadors arranged themselves on their platforms. The Veth administrator opened the agenda. The compact was Item 3. Items 1 and 2 passed without incident. When Item 3 was called, Councillor Vreth of the Veth Dominion rose to formally present the compact for ratification. His voice was deep and measured, carrying the particular tone of someone who considers a vote already concluded before it begins. He outlined the terms, cited the supporting documentation, and formally moved for ratification. The Solon ambassador offered the second. Standard procedure allowed any council member to speak before a vote. 3 smaller member worlds registered brief, polite objections that everyone in the hall understood would be overruled. Then the floor was open to final statements before the vote was called. I pressed the request indicator on my desk panel. There was a small pause. I do not think anyone in that hall had seen me press the indicator before. The administrator acknowledged me with the faint tone of someone who expects a short, easily dismissed comment. I stood up. Ambassador Voss of Earth, I said. I have a procedural matter to raise before this body proceeds to a vote. Vreth looked at me for the first time in weeks. Several other ambassadors turned in my direction with the mild curiosity of people watching something unexpected, but not yet interesting. Under Article 7 of the Council Charter, I said, specifically the supplementary amendment to the Foundational Compact ratified in the Council's 44th year, Clause 9 of Appendix 3, the Clause of Foundational Equity, I hereby formally invoke Earth's right to claim full retroactive membership status. I let that land. There was a silence in the hall that I had not heard before. Not the silence of boredom or routine, but the silence of a room full of extremely old, extremely experienced political minds all arriving at the same question at the same moment. Did she just? Earth has completed 3 full council cycles without a single procedural violation on record, I continued. Under the clause of foundational equity, our voting rights are hereby retroactive to the date of original admission. I am formally filing that invocation with the Council Secretariat now. I pressed the submission indicator on my desk. Across the hall, I could see Priya at her station in the document archive corridor. She gave me the smallest possible nod. She had verified the clause 3 days ago at my quiet request and had confirmed that it was real, unrepealed, and had never been invoked because no probationary member had ever fully read the founding documents. The hall erupted. Not with shouting. The council did not shout. It erupted in the way that old, formal institutions erupt, with a sudden flood of procedural requests, urgent whispered consultations, and the sound of 47 translation systems all working at maximum load as ambassadors spoke rapidly to their staff. Vreth had gone very still. The Solon ambassador, whose expression always carried that faint permanent amusement, had for the first time lost it entirely. The council's chief legal arbiter, a Durak being named Councillor Orath who had held that position for 60 years, requested an immediate recess. It was granted. The session was suspended. What followed was 4 hours in the legal review chamber. I sat in a small waiting room off the main corridor and drank the closest thing the station had to tea, a warm liquid produced by the Solon commissary that tasted vaguely like paper but was hot and caffeinated, and I waited. Oliver Burke called me 17 minutes into the recess. I did not answer. I sent him a text message that said, "Invoked the foundational equity clause. In recess. Will explain later." He sent back a message consisting entirely of questions. I set my communicator face down on the table. When the legal review concluded, the council reconvened. Councillor Orath stood at the central podium and announced, in the measured tone of someone delivering extremely uncomfortable news professionally, that the clause of foundational equity was valid, applicable, and legally binding. Earth's retroactive voting rights were confirmed. The invocation was on the record. The hall was very quiet. I stood again. "Thank you," I said. "In light of Earth's retroactive membership status, I am formally requesting that 3 prior council resolutions be flagged for procedural review. Specifically, the Hellion Corridor Trade Agreement of 18 months ago, the Boundary Realignment Resolution of 2 years ago, and the pre-allocation designation passed 27 months ago." I paused. I am also filing a formal procedural objection to the Outer Arm Resource Compact currently before this body, on the grounds that the compact conflicts with rights that Earth held at the time of those prior agreements and was not informed of or consulted on. The procedural objection alone was enough to trigger a mandatory review period, 90 days under council law. The compact could not be ratified while a formal procedural objection was pending. Vreth's composure held, because Vreth had not survived 40 years of council politics by letting emotion reach his face. But I watched his hands, and the 4 fingers of his upper right hand pressed very flat against his desk, which I had learned over 3 months of watching him was the Veth equivalent of clenching a jaw. The Solon ambassador said nothing at all. 3 of the smaller member world ambassadors, species who had been quietly boxed out of resource decisions for generations, were exchanging communications with rapid intensity. One of them, the representative of the Toval people, looked across the hall at me with an expression that I did not have a name for at the time. I would later understand it as the look of someone who had been waiting a very long time for something to shift and had just seen it happen. The session was adjourned for the day. I walked out of the convocation hall alone, through corridors that were suddenly full of the sound of rapid footsteps and urgent conversations in a dozen languages, all of it urgent, all of it directed somewhere that was not at me. Nobody stopped me, nobody spoke to me directly. I turned a corner into a quieter passage and allowed myself, for exactly 30 seconds, to lean against the wall and breathe. Then I stood up straight, adjusted my jacket and walked on. Behind me, the council was in more disarray than it had been in 4,000 years. I smiled all the way home. I had expected some reaction. I had not expected the reaction to come from 3 directions at once, within 48 hours, with the speed and coordination of something that had been planned before I even filed my invocation. That told me something important. It told me that the 5 major powers had considered the possibility of exactly this kind of move, somewhere in their contingency planning, and had already agreed on a response. They had not expected a human to make the move, or to make it so quickly, but the response itself had been sitting in a drawer waiting for the right occasion. The first direction was legal. Within 2 days of the session, a joint brief was filed by the Veth, the Solon, and the Durack Assembly, challenging the validity of my invocation on 3 separate procedural grounds. The arguments were technically sophisticated, citing secondary amendments and interpretive precedents that I had read, but that most other ambassadors would have needed legal staff to locate. They had clearly put senior legal minds on this. I had already anticipated all 3 arguments. I had written counter-responses to each of them the night before the session, sealed in the document archive, time-stamped, waiting. I filed them within 6 hours of the joint brief. The second direction was political. The Veth used their considerable network of allied worlds to quietly deliver a message to Earth's home government. The message was not threatening in any formal sense. It was, rather, a warm and diplomatic suggestion that Ambassador Voss had perhaps overstepped the bounds of what a new member world should attempt, and that Earth's long-term relationship with the Council's senior powers would benefit significantly from a more cooperative approach. There was no specific demand in the message. There did not need to be. The implication was clear enough. Oliver Burke called me within hours of the message arriving. He was not panicking, which I gave him credit for, but his voice had the careful flatness of someone working to keep panic out of it. "They're suggesting we recall you," he said. "They're suggesting you consider recalling me," I said. "That is different." Dara. "Oliver, if we recall me now, we lose everything the invocation achieved. The legal challenges succeed by default. The procedural objection is dropped. The compact goes through unchanged. Earth ends up in a worse position than before I filed because we will have demonstrated that we respond to pressure by retreating." There was a long pause on the line. "They're very large," Oliver said. "I know. That is why I prepared before I moved." Another pause. "What does that mean?" "It means I have what I need to hold the position. Trust me for 30 more days." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You have 20. I would take it." The third direction was the one I had prepared for most carefully, and the one I was least willing to discuss with Oliver. Set found me on the 4th day after the session. We were in a maintenance corridor on the station's lower level, a route I used because it was long, indirect, and very rarely used by anyone who was not servicing the environmental systems. Set communicated in light pulses, which my translation earpiece rendered in that patient, professorial tone, and what Set told me was this. A contact arrangement had been established with a firm known informally as the Shriven Syndicate. The syndicate did not have an official presence anywhere. They were a network, not a company. What they did when engaged was solve problems of the interpersonal kind, cleanly, professionally, and with absolute discretion. I had been designated a problem. I thanked Set, who pulsed something I took for concern, and walked back to my quarters through a different route. I sat at my desk for a long time that evening. I want to be clear about something. I was afraid. I have been asked since then in other contexts whether I was frightened during that period, and I want to answer honestly. Yes, I was frightened in the specific, focused way that makes your thoughts run very fast and very clearly, the way that burns away everything that is not essential. It is not a pleasant feeling. It is not courage in any cinematic sense. It is simply what happens when the options narrow and the only way forward is forward. I had prepared for this possibility because I had grown up on stories about what humans do when they have no good options. We had been doing this on our own planet for all of recorded history. Smaller groups negotiating with larger ones. Individuals navigating systems designed to sideline them. The specific texture of being in a room where the power is not on your side and finding the angle, the lever, the overlooked detail that changes the balance. We were not the strongest species in the council. We were not the oldest, the wealthiest, or the most politically connected. What we were, what I was a species and a person who had learned to think 3 moves ahead when 1 move was all anyone expected. I spent that evening reviewing 3 files I had been quietly building for months. The first was on Counselor Vreth. Nothing illegal, nothing personal. What I had was a documented pattern of pre-session lobbying activity that was not precisely against council rules, but was specifically against the code of conduct that the Veth Dominion had publicly signed 11 years ago as part of a transparency initiative. The gap between their public commitment and their actual behavior was, in diplomatic terms, extremely embarrassing. Embarrassing enough that its public release would cost Vreth his position, potentially destabilize the Dominion's current council majority, and trigger a formal ethics inquiry. The second was on the Solon ambassador, a being named Counselor Vess. The financial arrangement with the Solon trade house that Cal had mentioned months ago. I had tracked it carefully. It was not illegal under council law. It was, however, a direct conflict of interest with 3 votes Vess had cast in the past year, votes on trade zone designations that had directly benefited the trade house in question. If I filed a formal conflict disclosure, the votes in question would be subject to review. The Solon were meticulous about their reputation for neutrality in commercial matters. This would not just embarrass Vess. It would create a legal complication for the Solon that would take years to resolve. The third file was on the Durack Assembly representative, Counselor Pell. The Durack had a long-running internal political situation involving 2 factions within their assembly, and Pell represented the faction currently in power. What I had found, through 3 months of patient listening and careful cross-referencing of public records, was that Pell had been conducting quiet diplomatic contacts with a rival power in the outer sectors, contacts that had not been disclosed to the Durack Assembly's own internal oversight board. This was entirely a Durack internal matter and not a council violation. However, if it became known within the Durack Assembly, it would be a serious problem for Pell's faction, at a time when the internal balance of power was already delicate. None of my 3 files were weapons precisely, they were leverage. Leverage is different. Leverage says, I know something, you know I know something, we can choose what happens next together. I requested private meetings with all 3 ambassadors within 48 hours of Set's warning. Vreth agreed to meet first. He met me in a neutral consultation room and sat with the calm, controlled posture of someone who had expected this conversation and prepared for it. I placed my data pad on the table between us, face down, and I talked. I did not threaten. I explained. I told him what I had. I told him what I would and would not do with it depending on how the next few weeks proceeded. I told him that I had no interest in causing disruption for its own sake. I told him that I understood what he was trying to protect and that there were ways to protect it that did not require Earth to be shut out of its own expansion corridor. He listened without expression. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in his deep, measured voice, "How long have you been building those files?" "Since my second week," I said. Another pause. "Were you ever genuinely uncertain about your position here?" I thought about that. About the first day, the wrong chair, the second-rate earpiece, Oliver calling every 72 hours, the 47 civilizations who had not bothered to remember my name. "Yes," I said, "constantly." He looked at me for a moment longer than I expected. Then he said, "I will make 3 calls this afternoon." The Shriven Syndicate contract was canceled within 36 hours. The legal challenge was quietly reduced to a single argument, the weakest of the 3, within a week. The meetings with Vess and Pell followed a similar pattern, not friendly, not easy, but functional. By the end of the second week, all 3 had shifted from active opposition to a careful, watchful neutrality. Oliver called me on the 18th day. "The pressure on us from the Veth has stopped," he said. He sounded genuinely confused. "Good," I said. "What did you do?" "I had conversations," I said, "diplomatic ones." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you all right?" It was the first time he had asked that. I looked out the small porthole of my quarters at the darkness between stars, which at this distance from any sun was absolute and total and perfectly, beautifully still. "Yes," I said, "I am completely all right." And I was. Not because the danger was over or because I had won anything or because the next 90 days were going to be easy, but because I had moved through the fear and come out the other side, and what was waiting there was clarity. I closed the call, opened my notebook, and started planning what came next. 90 days is a long time in galactic politics. It is also, when used correctly, exactly long enough to change everything. I spent the first week of the review period doing something that none of the 5 major powers expected. I stopped fighting them directly. I turned around and started talking to everyone else. There were, in the Galactic Council, 48 member worlds. 5 of them held most of the power. The other 43 had been watching the Council's decisions for generations with the particular patience of beings who have learned that the formal process is not really designed for them. Not hostile, not defeated, just quietly aware that the room was arranged for other people's benefit, and that making too much noise about it was more costly than it was worth. I had been in their outer ring. I understood the view from there. I began with the Toval representative, a woman named Counselor Nara, whose look across the chamber after my invocation I had not forgotten. The Toval were a mid-sized civilization, technically sophisticated, economically strong in their home sector, but consistently underweighted in council decisions because of the voting math. 3 generations of Toval ambassadors had tried and failed to shift that math through traditional lobbying. Nara was the 4th. I sat across from her in the station's small public garden, a pressurized enclosure full of plants from a dozen different worlds, and I told her what I was trying to do, not in vague terms, specifically. The Outer Arm Resource Compact, the 3 agreements I intended to reopen, the changes I believed were achievable if the right coalition came together during the 90-day window. She listened. When I finished, she said, "What do you want from us?" "Your voice," I said. "Not your vote on the floor, not yet, just your willingness to be part of a conversation." She looked at me for a long moment. Why should the Toval risk the relationship with the Veth that we have spent 60 years carefully building? It was a fair question. I had prepared for it. "Because that relationship," I said carefully, "has spent 60 years costing you more than it has given you, and you know it, and they know you know it, and nothing has changed because nobody has offered you an alternative that was worth the cost of choosing it. I am offering you that alternative." She was quiet. "Also," I said, "I am not asking you to fight anyone. I am asking you to sit at a table." Nara agreed to sit at the table. Over the following 2 weeks, I had the same conversation, in different forms, with 6 other small and mid-size member worlds. The Asari Compact, a quiet civilization of deep ocean beings whose world sat directly adjacent to the proposed extraction zones. The Drovan Union, 3 small worlds that had been trying for 40 years to get a formal seat on the Council's Resource Oversight Committee. The Pelion Assembly, a species of remarkable engineers who had been providing technical support to the Solon extraction operations for decades, compensated far below what their work was worth, because the agreement had been structured before they had a strong enough council position to negotiate the terms. Every single one of them came to the table. I want to explain something about what I was doing because it was not clever in any complicated way. It was simple. It was the most human thing I knew how to do. I was listening. Every species I talked to had a specific need, a specific frustration, a specific thing they had wanted for years and had not been able to obtain because the system was not designed to give it to them. I listened to all of it. I did not promise things I could not deliver. I did not pretend that what I was building was anything other than what it was, a coalition of overlooked worlds who collectively had enough votes to force a renegotiation, if they chose to act together. The 5 major powers noticed, of course. They had political intelligence networks that dwarfed anything Earth possessed. Vreth sent me a message in the 5th week that was ostensibly an inquiry about the review process, but was actually asking, in the careful indirect language of council diplomacy, what I thought I was assembling. I sent back a message that was equally indirect and said, in essence, something that benefits everyone if everyone is willing. He did not respond immediately, but the response when it came 3 days later was not hostile, it was cautious, which was different. In week 6, I made the next move. I formally proposed a revised version of the compact, not a rejection of the original agreement, a modification. The core extraction rights that the 5 powers wanted were preserved, scaled slightly, and restructured with a new oversight framework that included rotating seats for member worlds that were geographically adjacent to the extraction zones. A protected zone designation was added around the systems closest to Earth's corridor, not blocking development, but establishing a formal consultation requirement before any new extraction operations could begin. And a new seat was created on the Resource Oversight Committee, the Developing World's chair, open to any member world that had joined the Council within the past 100 years and had not previously held a committee position, rotating between eligible worlds every 10 years. The seat was not for Earth specifically. It was structural. It would benefit every small or new world in the Council for as long as the Council existed. The 5 major powers pushed back. Of course they did. The negotiations over the next 4 weeks were long and detailed, and at several points appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Vreth was a skilled negotiator, and he found every weakness in the proposal and pressed on it. The Solon were more subtle, working the margins, trying to peel individual members of my coalition away with targeted side offers. 2 of the 7 worlds I had recruited took the side offers. I had expected this. I had built the coalition with that expectation, choosing the 8 I thought I needed to keep and using the others as a buffer. When 2 left, I still had 6, and 6 was enough for the math I needed. On the 87th day of the 90-day review period, the revised compact was agreed. Not unanimously. The Solon abstained on 2 clauses. The Durac registered a formal objection to the oversight framework that everyone understood was political rather than substantive. But the vote passed. The Resource Compact, changed almost beyond recognition from its original form, was ratified by the Galactic Council. I sat in my seat at the outer edge of the chamber and watched the vote complete on the display panel in front of me. I had not moved to a better seat. I had not asked for one. I was still in the outermost ring, still using the second-generation earpiece that dropped syllables, still sitting at the desk that was the wrong height for my chair. None of that had ever mattered. When the session ended, the hall took a long time to clear. There was a great deal of conversation, the kind that follows a decision that everyone knows will have consequences for a long time. I gathered my things slowly and began walking toward the exit. I was almost at the corridor door when I heard my name. I turned. The being walking toward me was the elder representative of the Orionese Collective, the oldest continuous member of the Galactic Council. His name was Counselor Air, and he had been the Orionese representative for nearly 200 years. He was not large. The Orionese rarely were. He moved with the particular unhurried quality of something that has been alive long enough that rushing no longer seems reasonable. He stopped in front of me. "Ambassador Voss," he said. His translation always came through as a dry, careful whisper. "I would like to understand something if you are willing." "Of course," I said. "On your first day here," he said, "before any session had begun, before you had spoken to anyone or seen any proceedings, I observed you take your seat, and you smiled." I waited. "You smiled the same way today when the vote concluded, and I have noticed in between that you have smiled at many points in this process, including several at which any reasonable observer would have expected you to look concerned." He paused. "I have been a member of this council for nearly 2 centuries. I have seen many new members arrive. I have never seen one who smiled as much as you." "I did not realize it was noticeable," I said. "Only to those paying very close attention," he said, "which, I will admit, I was not for the first several weeks." We stood in the emptying hall for a moment. "What does it mean?" he asked, the smiling. I thought about how to answer him. I thought about the first day, the wrong chair, the handed-over rulebook, the assumption that I was temporary and harmless and not worth close attention. I thought about Oliver's calls and Priya in the archive, and Seth in the maintenance corridor, and Nara agreeing to sit at a table. I thought about what it means to come from a species that has always been, in some sense, the smallest thing in the room. "When I walked in here," I said, "I was one person representing a world that had been a council member for 11 months. Every other civilization in this hall had been doing this for centuries, some of them for millennia. Nobody expected me to do anything. Nobody was watching me. I had no political capital, no alliances, no leverage, and no position on any committee." I paused. "On Earth, we have a long history of being in exactly that position. Not enough resources, not enough allies, not enough time. Smaller than the thing we are facing, slower to start, further behind. We have that history at every scale, between countries, between communities, between individuals. And what we learned across all of that history is that when nobody expects anything from you, you have something that the people at the front of the room almost never have." Air waited. "Freedom," I said. "Nobody is watching you. Nobody is tracking your moves. Nobody has modeled your behavior or prepared a response to it. You can read the rulebook they handed you as a joke and find the clause that has been sitting in it for 4,000 years. You can make friends with the people that nobody else is talking to. You can build something in the spaces between everyone else's attention." He was quiet for a long moment. "And the smiling," he said. "The smiling," I said, "is because there is a particular kind of joy that comes from being underestimated. It is not a cruel joy. It is not about proving anyone wrong exactly. It is the feeling of standing in a room full of closed doors and realizing that you have time and patience and a very thorough knowledge of which doors are not actually locked." Air looked at me with the expression I was beginning to understand, was as close as the Orionese came to warmth. "We will not underestimate your world again," he said. "I know," I said. "That's fine. I got what I needed." He inclined his head and walked away. I stood in the hall for another moment after he left. Alone in the large, emptying space with its impossible ceiling and its thin, high clouds, this room that had been running on the same assumptions for 4,000 years, that was now, quietly, running on slightly different ones. I thought about Earth, about a planet full of people who had no idea that any of this had happened, who were going about their lives in complete ignorance of the fact that a woman in a poorly fitted chair, in the outermost ring of an alien legislative chamber, had just spent 3 months reading footnotes and making friends with the right people and rearranging what was possible for their future. I would call Oliver tomorrow. He would ask a lot of questions. I would answer most of them. But right now I just stood there in the quiet in the hall that 4,000 years of history had built, and I let myself feel it fully. Not triumph, not relief, though there was relief, something quieter and more lasting than either of those. I had walked in with nothing but a rule book and a clean record, and the specific human skill of finding the angle nobody else had tried. I was walking out with 3 reopened trade agreements, a new committee seat for developing worlds, a protected corridor, and a coalition of 7 civilizations that had never had a reason to work together before. Not bad, I thought, for the species with the wrong chair. I turned off the lights in my section of the hall, a small automated courtesy, and walked out into the corridor. The Galactic Council was louder now than it had been before I arrived, more contested, more complicated. A dozen smaller member worlds had already sent formal requests for meetings with my office, and my office was still just me and a data pad and a notebook that nobody else could read. That was fine. I had time. And somewhere behind me, 47 civilizations were learning, very slowly, to pay attention to the human in the room. I smiled all the way home.